I'll let you start first, Alex.
Okay. There's two companies for me. West Coast Seeds. It was established, I think, in 1983. Looking for really good varieties, organic as well, mostly focused on organics, and stuff that would grow really well in the Pacific Northwest. Really good disease-resistant varieties, plus stuff that could grow in shorter days. Of course, we love the stuff that comes from Patty's group of Seeds by Design and Terra. And I also have a farm with my wife called Lucky Sun Farm. We're now certified organic, so we're pretty happy and proud about that. So we only have 4.5 acres, so a very small farm, but it's fun to make sure we plant things and grow things and test it and see what we can do over the year, even into the fall and even in through winter. So, and that's who we are.
Cool. So I'm Patty Buskirk. I'm the managing partner in Seeds by Design and Terra Organics. Started in 1994. I always remember that date because it was the same year that my youngest daughter was born. So we're basically wholesale seed producer, and we produce everything, vine seeds and tomatoes and so we're looking forward to chatting with everybody on the call about your cucurbit needs this morning. So
excellent. Okay. And I'm Diane Blazek with All America Selections and National Garden Bureau. National Garden Bureau is the one hosting these webinars, but it's very possible when we're talking about different varieties, you might hear the mention of All America Selections winners. So we'll just kind of fold those right in. Today, we're talking about cucurbits. And since it's, I'll call it a broad category, a semi-broad category, do you guys which one of you wants to take on a definition of cucurbits?
I'm happy to do that. So it's kind of interesting, people call them cucurbits, but there's actually only true, like 5 true Cucurbitaceae species in the cucurbit family. Most people consider most vine seeds to be cucurbits. So, and we'll talk, instead of using all the Latin names, I'm going to talk about the, it's easier to talk about, just the common names. So watermelon is a cucurbit species. So when you think, and citrons. So if you think about watermelons, I always think of everything, especially being a seed producer, I think of in their like groups and subspecies, because then you think about isolation requirements. So when you think about watermelons, I also think about citrons because they have a similar chromosome number and they outcross with watermelons. So you have to make sure when you're doing the isolation that if you're not growing one or you're saving seeds, that you don't have some of both. Then, we'll kind of go alphabetically backwards, which is winter squash. And winter squash and summer squash and pumpkins all share the same basic family, of species and subspecies. So it's Cucurbita pepo, which is your standard pumpkin. And that's also the same as like for a crookneck or a straight neck or a zucchini. So it kind of makes it a seed production nightmare when you're, isolating pepos because they come in every shape or form. Then there's Cucurbita Maxima, which is also another pumpkin species or winter cross species. That's like Hubbard squash or Big Mac pumpkins, those great big Atlantic giant or show winner, great big, exhibition pumpkins. Those are Cucurbita Maxima. Then there's Cucurbita machata, and I'm sure everybody knows exactly what these are. You just don't call them by their fancy name. They're like butternut squash. So, everybody's favorite squash that they eat in the fall and for Thanksgiving is, truly a third different species of squash and pumpkins and winter squash. There's another species called mixta, which especially you people from the South will know exactly what this is. It's the cushaw types, those great big long neck pumpkins. Some come with green stripes, some come with orange stripes. Those are Cucurbita mixta. Then there's the poor, we'll toss the gourds in here too, because they're all part and parcel as far as I'm concerned. Then there's the gourds, like the Lagenaria species of gourds that I think are way cool, and they're one of my favorite things to produce because they actually their flowers only flower in the early morning. They're almost like moonflowers, and the flowers grow way above the canopy and they're bright colored white. That's Lagenaria species. those are bottle gourds or caveman club gourds. I'm sure that if you guys have done any art projects or anything, crafty projects with those, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Their leaves are really hairy and they smell awful. But, you get that great, hard, kind of maraca type gourd that comes out of those. Then when you're thinking about other gourds, and this is ones that people don't think about very often, are like Luffa Gourds, which are another completely different species. Or Alex, I'm sure that you have grown some of these up in with your incredible Asian influence in the northern Pacific Northwest. I don't even remember the type of them, but it's another type of gourd. I think they call them a melon gourd or something like that. They're
Bitter
very
melon?
cool. Yeah,
Bitter
bitter
melon?
melon type gourds. And we haven't even got to the next one alphabetically backwards, since we've done summer squash, winter squash, pumpkins, gourds, and then there's melons and cantaloupes. I consider them all melons, but some people consider cantaloupes to be separate. That's Cucumis mellow, which is the honeydews, of course, are the rind ones. I personally think that melons is a very, very forgotten vine seed or cucurbit species, because it has so much biodiversity, from a teeny tiny little Queen Anne's pocket melon to a great big giant cassava and everything in between. Honeydews and rock melons and little bitty melons and Crenshaws, because Charente types. If you're a cantaloupe fan, you need to go expand your growing horizons in cantaloupes and watermelons in the melon species. One cool thing about this species that most people don't realize, which I love them and they're in my garden, which is Armenian cucumbers. They're not cucumbers. They're actually melons that are harvested as cucumbers. So if you grow those striped or the dark ones or the white Armenian cucumbers, those are actually melon species. So like I said, I'm kind of going backwards. The last ones is cucumbers. And of course, cucumbers, there's all kinds of different types of cucumbers. There's the little bitty West Indian gherkins. There's the hedgehog type, kind of spiny like cucumbers. And then of course your, average everyday pickling cucumbers and slicing cucumbers and beta alpha Parisian types that don't have any. Those are my personal favorite. They don't have any spines. They only have hairs on them and they're super sweet. You can eat the skins. And then one type of cucumber that somebody has just, I guess they become more popular again, probably because somebody wrote about them, was Kirby cucumbers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kirby cucumbers. It's kind of a cucumber that's somewhere in between a true pickle and a slicer. And that's historically what they refer to as a Kirby cucumber. Did I cover all the species there, Diane?
I think you did. I mean, you're the expert, not me. But I had a question that just popped in my mind. What about those little cucamelons that grow on the vines? Is that a cucurbit?
Yes.
And gherkins, yeah.
Yeah, gherkins, yeah.
The gherkins, I was thinking of those, they're like 1 inch long. They look like tiny
gherkins.
Little, okay. I had never heard them called gherkins. I was thinking there were two different things. So, okay.
Yeah.
See, I learned something new every time.
They get thrown in the pickle. They get thrown in the pickle category.
Yeah. So one thing I forgot to tell everybody in the beginning is if you have questions, just type them in the chat and we will get to them when we're, kind of on that topic. There's a good chance I might have already asked your questions. And while we go through here, you guys can just throw out some of your favorites, because I'm sure there's going to be some as we're talking about them. But Alex, since you work directly with consumers a lot, what are you seeing trend wise? Is there a big, well, I know 2020, there was a big surge of interest in everything, but, can you look at it over the last 5 or 10 years and say, oh, cucurbits have really expanded, or the gherkins have expanded and the pickling ones have, what kind of comments do you have from that angle?
Oh, we see, 2020 and everybody growing in their backyard, we saw a huge increase. We see a lot of diversity in a lot of the plants that people are growing. People don't want just the staples anymore. Certain regions, some regions, it's potatoes and corn. That's it. And some lettuce. Don't try to bring in some kale. But what we're really seeing is up here, we're very diverse in, the Pacific Northwest, where a lot of the buttercup squash, kabocha, we can call it curry, where it's the smaller varieties for the empty nesters, so that what happens is you cut it in half. It's enough for 2 people to eat. There's no leftovers, no waste. Those were trending for a while, and we see them continue. And then, of course, cucumbers like the cucamelon, which we call it, was the Mexican gherkin. Oh, it's just off the chart, where everybody wants to grow it. It's fun, play with your kids. And then there's little melons that you can eat. And it's very easy to make a salad because you just rinse them, wash it, it's done. You don't have to slice it. You just throw it in there, cherry tomatoes as well in your salad. We see that. The other, well, of course, pumpkins, and the different varieties of pumpkins that are out there, it's mind-boggling. I think we went on a tour of the Dallas Arboretum where they had 75,000 pumpkins, correct me if I'm wrong, and it was beautiful. They made a Cinderella carriage with all these different types, and some of the stuff from I think Seeds by Design were grown and out there. It was just beautiful how they made that. So we just see those things trending where people really want to decorate and also want to eat. There's one new pumpkin. It was really, well, it's not that new anymore. Naked Bear. There's Lady Godiva, Naked Bear, and they're hull-less pumpkin seeds. So you just have to cut it and then roast it just slightly because they don't have a shell on them, and just munch away. It's just fantastic and a nice snack.
And let's not forget pepitas, which is one of Patty's entries into All America Selections and AAS winner, another hull-less pumpkin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that one was great. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, so now Patty, as a breeder, what kind of things are you working toward? So I guess we could fit this in the category with trends, but based on your customers as well as consumers, because you don't sell directly to consumers. So you're selling to like Alex, who then sells to the consumer. When you're doing your breeding work and you're trying to come up with new varieties, what types of things are you breeding for?
So that's a great question. That segues perfectly into what Alex was talking about with pepitas and hull-less pumpkins. There's a huge surge right now for pumpkin seed oil for processing and for just as an oil replacement and protein replacement. So I actually have an organic grower that I just gave a whole bunch of different samples of, because they're looking at producing pumpkin seed oil, which comes exactly from those hull-less pumpkin seeds that Alex was talking about. So that, that's a trend. And so, that I'd already bred that, but Alex mentioned it too, color. Everybody wants something to be a different color, kind of like blue pumpkins or white pumpkins, dark red colored pumpkins, warty winter squash. Flavor is huge, and sweetness also. Cornell University is doing a lot of breeding and testing with different Cucurbita Maxima, Cucurbita Machata types of squash to increase the sugar level. Honey Nut was one of theirs. It's an older release of theirs, but it's a goodie, and there's a lot of it that's sold. That one has typically higher bricks than other butternuts do. I mean, that's just an example of what breeders are, all breeders, every breeder breeds for uniformity and maturity and the normal things that everybody is always going to want, more disease resistance, this and that in any species. It just not cucurbit species, but there is a huge trend, especially for like colored winter squash, something specialty. And I agree with Alex when he said, 5-6 years ago, the trend was everybody wanted something small. Everybody wanted, a sweet dumpling type or a smaller winter squash. I think we're over that hump now. And I think everybody is now more interested in, something that's going to grow in their garden and they're going to have an abundance that they're going to be able to eat. I think the whole pandemic really opened everyone's eyes to, food security and what's going on with my food. And, maybe I want to grow it in my backyard. So, the next time I go to the grocery store and it's not there, that, or something that I want. I mean, I'm seeing people grow potatoes, like you mentioned, and I never grew potatoes before. My son-in-law grows them, and then he brings over a great big pile over to my house. It's like, really, I'm not a potato fan, but thanks, Tim, because he grew potatoes and now he's got, bushels and bushels and bushels of them. So, so I think people are very, very, very interested and they want to include their children in it's an educational process, and gardening is it's great. It's outdoors. It's fun. They're going to learn something. And that also, they want something striped. They want something unique, they're talking about the gherkins and, something totally unique for people. That's something kids like. That's something they're going to remember. So I think those are all kinds of things that breeders are breeding.
And what about, you mentioned something about bush types and, so for all the different cucurbits that we're talking about today, do they come in bush type and vinings? And do you see more of a demand for the bush types because then they don't take as much room in your garden?
Yeah, they are. There's the traditional gardeners that you're not going to grow an exhibition pumpkin on a bush type. It's going to be a great big one. But there are more bush pumpkins that are available. A lot of people are having a lot of success, in their raised beds in their backyard. I think Burpee did a really, really nice promotion about 7 years ago on what you can do just in a 2 10 by 10 foot raised beds in your backyard, and how much produce you can actually grow out of that. And I think, with everything and the, crazy surge in, of the pandemic, I think people are realizing they don't need 15 zucchini plants. They only need 1 or 2, and a couple bush pumpkins and one cherry tomato and a couple beefsteaks. And, they can have produce for the whole summer. So
yeah. Good point. Okay, so let's talk about growing them. Is there a best place to grow cucumber? Okay, full sun, we know that. But what else for placement or types of soil that they grow best in?
Well, I can tell you, I have lots of different soil types that I've grown cucurbits on, and they'll just about grow everywhere, even the crack in the cement in the back of my warehouse. They're pretty hardy. They grow just about anywhere. The true key to success is to that they don't like is they don't really, really, really like very tight soils. They like loose, kind of flocculated soils. That helps with drainage because they don't like to have real wet feet. And so, and they don't, the most success that you're going to have as far as irrigation is they don't want to be moist all the time, but they don't want to get completely dry either, to the point where, they're wilting, what a plant looks like when it's 105 outside. And, so I would say, not continual, but, don't let them get too dry and don't let them get too wet. I mean, that's pretty much and then, I think, they're actually pretty easy to grow. You're right, full sun, they're sun worshipers. I mean, the reason that watermelons were actually grown in desert areas was because it was water storage. I mean, and they grow in very, very droughty, very arid areas. So don't over irrigate your watermelons, or, you're going to have all kinds of problems with them. So I always say it's okay to neglect your cucurbits a little bit, and they're not heavy feeders. I mean, I don't put more than 90 units of nitrogen per year on them, which is not very much compared to sweet corn that takes, 250 plus. So.
Yeah, the only thing I can add is for cucumbers, and people ask that, why do my cucumbers become bitter or don't taste that good? It's inconsistent watering. So, and just making sure you're consistently keeping it moist. So even though there's dry times, if there's consistent moisture for the cucumbers, they won't go bitter. Have some nice product. Yeah.
So that probably, I mean, not the bitterness part, but that holds true for all cucurbits, is the consistent watering then.
And in container growing, you can grow a ton of different squash in containers. There's many bush type, but it's just making sure that the container is big enough and wide enough, because it'll topple over. Because some of that stuff's heavy. Like you look at the scallopini type of zucchini or a squash. Those they're very heavy producers, but they'll fall over. Like Sunburst is just an amazing variety. That's an All-American Selection winner, and then it's very, very productive. But if you don't have a good 5 gallon to 10, 15 gallon pot, yeah, it's going to fall over or not be big enough for it to support the plant and the produce. Yeah.
All right. So you answered my one question too about growing in containers. So pretty much they can be, as long as it's a large enough container. And I think that's the advice I give people all the time when we're talking about container gardening is, don't do these little 4-inch pots that they come in from the garden center. That's not going to keep it. Make sure you have a large enough container. So that's one of my tips. What about hills? Are there certain cucurbits that do better in hills? Is that an old wives' tale, or is it true? And what do you recommend?
Go ahead, Alex.
My perspective is I don't use hills. I don't hill up because here in the Pacific Northwest, we'll have like really dry spells. And then it just makes it really hard to keep it consistently moist. Where some things will hill up, but like potatoes, but for the squash or for the cucumbers, we don't. And then we just use drip tape on them. So we try not to water the leaves. We don't really find a big difference in productivity. Well, actually, we just find it easier to keep it moist than anything than hilling. The only difference is, the Three Sisters philosophy of corn, beans, and squash. The beans will grow up the corn, and the squash is around it and keeping the moisture in the soil. Other than that, we don't hill up.
Can you expand on that? Not watering the foliage, keeping the foliage dry, and give some tips on that?
Yeah, so we're near the ocean, so we get a ton of moisture overnight, and of course there's a variety of diseases, and I'm not an expert in diseases. I think Patty is, but downy mildew and powdery mildew. When you have really moist leaves overnight, it just there's a lot of disease pressure, so it'll affect the plant. A lot of times here we try to not water overhead for any of the squash or the cucumbers or the melons. We try to use irrigation lines like drip tape on top of the soil. We don't put ours in the ground, but I know some people do, and it works well for them. We're here, we just try not to have wet leaves overnight, because then that moisture just sits, and then there's heat and humidity that just it'll take over and create an issue for you.
Alex is right. A rule of thumb, we don't, it's actually in some of our seed production contracts for no overhead irrigation past stand establishment, just to reduce disease pressure and potential seed-borne diseases, since we're, of course, we're harvesting the seed. It's the seed product. So if you don't want to encourage, anything coming from any host plants that are around in the area that could be harboring any seed-borne diseases. So we don't typically do any overhead, overhead irrigation also, which is difficult in a garden setting. Sometimes it's much easier to, be able to do that, with your automated sprinkler system or this and that. So I tend to recommend, like Alex did, to put in some kind of a drip system that, there's an emitter for, one of your pumpkin plants, an emitter for one of your squash plants, an emitter for your, and then set it up on a timer. So, you're getting, 1 to 2 hours out of your emitter every day, depending on how you set it, 1 gallon or 3 gallons per hour, depending on the temperatures. If you need, gets hot and crazy like it is in the, the West right now, you're going to have to, do some supplemental irrigation with your drip irrigation. So that's what we recommend to out here. And that's what we tend to do. Most of our fields are either, we refer to as surface water. So it's either, furrow irrigation or, buried drip or drip irrigation. So.
Yeah, excellent tip. Okay, so we've talked about diseases, and this next topic is the one that I see most all over social media: pictures, gross things on vines, etc. So what about our pest? What about the squash bug that defoliates the plants? The squash borers from, digging in there and leaving their refuse at the base of the plant and killing the vine. So let's talk about some of the common pests and what your recommendations are to get rid of them.
So the number one problem with chewing and, chewing pests like aphids or Dibroticas, cucumber beetles, and squash bugs, assassin bugs, those are all chewing insects. The biggest thing that you're missing here that you're not seeing past the bug infestation that's making a mess is they're also spreading all kinds of virus that's weakening your plant, and then it's opening it up for more insects to, and then you have a problem. So whenever you think about that, you need to try to think the best way, and you don't need to go spray with any kind of a chemical. There's all kinds of organic methods that you can deter creepy crawly pests in your cucurbits. I use in my garden diatomaceous earth. I go out there and I sprinkle diatomaceous earth out around the base of my pumpkins and squash and cucumbers, mainly because that deters all of those creepy crawling insects to come in, and they don't like it. It's very sharp and they don't like to crawl on it. Then you don't, I choose a preventative method instead of a go and spray it method, which, there's all kinds of organic insecticides that you can use if you get an infestation, and here they come. But so I tend to try and use a little bit more of a preventative method before. And, people also say companion plant. So if you plant stinky flowers like marigolds or something like that, other things that also helps with pollination, because of course, every one of these cucurbit species that we've been talking about requires pollination. So you're going to have some kind of a pollinator haven to attract the attract the pollination to occur. Most cucurbits are monoecious, which means that they have separate male and female flowers, and the pollen has to be transferred manually or via a pollinator or your hand, if you're going to do it yourself on your own pumpkins, has to be exchanged to the female plant. So that's so planting, other kinds of thyme. Some people plant thyme, oregano, herbs or something mixed in. Just imagine something that you don't have any pest on, interplant those typically in your garden, and then let them flower. Let your basil go to flower, let your thyme flower, and then you're also creating, a pollinator host too.
We also suggest planting dill. So if you look at dill, they're umbellifers. So when it starts to go to seeds, an upside down umbrella, and those really attract the beneficial insects, the predatory aphids or the predatory wasps, that'll feed on aphids and other things. So they also help. And then nasturtiums are handy. They're more of a trap crop where I try to plant them away from the squash or away from things that I want to protect, so that, the nasturtiums will be covered in aphids, but not the plant that you're trying to protect. Up here in the Pacific Northwest, we have slugs. We have like a slug army at our property. It's like we're in a forest, and it's a wet forest. So that's the biggest problem we have in the issue. And the only thing that, we suggest is ducks. They love slugs and they love snails. We have our ducks coming, but we have a duck pond and everything. And that's the only way that we can battle them, because it's just an onslaught. They'll come from a half a block away if they know there's some sweet things to eat. And they love squash plants when they're young. Wow, I probably lost 40 plants already. Wow. On the young ones. Yeah, once they get big enough, because they have those little prickly on their stems, they're okay. But when they're early stages, they just love to just devour them.
You know what I did? Well, I started doing it years ago on my hostas. When they were coming up in the spring, I would put metal coffee cans around them so the bunnies couldn't get them. And when they got big enough, then I could pull the cans off and the bunnies didn't bother them. I did that with my lettuce this year and it worked, but I didn't do that with my green beans. All my green beans are gone now because of the bunnies. So, you win some, you lose some, right? And Patty, I have to tell you, a couple of years ago, I think we were in your fields and you were demonstrating. We got a video of, pollinating male flower to female flower, which I do want to talk about. I got my first 2 yellow squash this weekend because I hand pollinated thanks to you. So thank you very much.
It's easy. Most people think, oh, this is so hard. It's way easy. And most people don't realize too that most cucurbit flowers, they only last a day. So when you see that flower out there, take advantage of it, pollinate it, and move on, because tomorrow it's going to be a different one that's open. People always say, why are there so many flowers on squash and pumpkins? Because they only flower for a day.
Exactly. So let's talk about that. Do they typically get male flowers first? And which of these, I mean, then we're going to have to go into, I think you already started talking about the monaceous and everything, but let's talk about male flowers, female flowers. Do male flowers come first all the time? Do you have to do anything other than like I did, hand pollinate if you want? So let's just talk about this topic.
Alex, you want me to take this one?
Yep.
So yeah, and perfect example is watermelons and summer squash. So there are separate male and female flowers on them. You can tell the difference because the male flowers tend to have a long stem. They call it the style, or the filament on it. It's called the filament, and then it has the flower on the end. Of course, the female flowers have the fruit on them. So you'll see the flower part is attached to like the ball of the watermelon or the bulb of the squash. Now, nature, she's very, very, very smart, and she totally understands that you need to start making male flowers before you have female flowers. So most crops will, especially ones that are monoecious, and monoecious just means they have separate male and female flowers. They're an incomplete flower, but that just means that they're separate on the plants. So you will always typically see the first flowers on your summer squash plant will always be male flowers. Don't think that there's anything wrong with them. And I go and pick them and stuff them with cream cheese and then turn them into fritters because I like squash blossoms. But later on, leave them on there so you can pollinate your females because you're going to need to be able to, like I talked about before, the pollen transfer. You need to take the pollen from the male flower and put it on the stigmatic surface. That's that funny looking brain-like thing that's on the end of the female flower. And it doesn't take anything. You don't have to use a paintbrush. You just have to lightly touch the anthers, which is the part that the pollen dehisces on and attaches to the female part, and then boom, all of a sudden you've done your bees work. Especially in urban areas, there's a decreasing amount of bees. Where I live, there's bees everywhere because I live in California, and they got to park all these bees somewhere that they pollinate these almonds with in February. So they're everywhere. I mean, there's beehives and apiaries all around me. So there is no shortage of bees where I am. But where my second home is in Santa Fe, New Mexico, there is a shortage of pollinators. So if I was going to have a garden down there, I would probably hand pollinate my cucurbits to get them to set. So if you're in any kind of a very, very dry or remote area, or even a very, very urban area, you probably might want to consider to, pollinate them. So you're going to get your, brand new zucchini for 4th of July to throw on the grill. Did that answer all your questions, Diane, on that process?
I think it did. And I'm sorry if you said this. Is it a good idea to go ahead and pick some of the male flowers off in the beginning? Will that encourage the female flowers to come quickly?
I don't see that in mine, but some people say that works. If Alex talked very, 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 very nice about stress and watering, and that, the non-bitterness on your cucumbers, and he doesn't mean constant, like, drench them and have them standing. It's just continual, timed scheduled irrigation. Extra male flowers on your zucchinis or your pumpkins, and they're not setting females, is a indicator of stress on your plants. So if you have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of male flowers, and you're waiting and it's a week or two and you still don't have any female flowers, it could be a sign that your plants are stressed. Is it water stress? Is it nutrient stress? Is it calcium? The number one nutrient that typically is a deficiency in cucurbits is calcium. Because if you don't have enough calcium, okay, we're going to get a little off on a technical thing here. It messes up your nutrient triangle. And when you talk about calcium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, it's all interconnected. It's all in a triangle. And some people, if you have too much calcium, and if you have not enough calcium, it can mess up your ratio of your nutrient balance. So that's the number one thing. If I can walk out and there's a crazy spot like an alkali patch in a field, and it'll be nothing but male flowers all over the plant. Well, it's because the calcium's tied up. and those plants are nutrient deficient. So, but it also does the same thing with watering. So if you're underwatering or overwatering, the plant is stressed, and they tend to make more male flowers when they're stressed.
Good. Okay, another question on the male-female flower thing, and you can tell a lot of this is from personal experience right now. So you got a female flower and it gets a little squash that's maybe 2 inches long and it starts to rot because it wasn't pollinated, obviously.
Right.
Should we remove that so that the energy just goes back into new flowers?
Yeah. That's incomplete pollination. And that
Mhm.
happens when you don't have enough pollinators. You don't have enough. So, that's when, you got to become the pollinator.
Yes, indeed.
That's a great indicator to go out and, one morning. Most cucurbit plants only pollinate for about 3 to 4 hours a day.
Wow.
And they typically don't pollinate in the afternoon.
Okay. Let's see. What was the next question I was going to ask? Oh, what about up in the north? Because we're in the north, we have a shorter growing season. Any tips on growing any of the cucurbits in the north?
I'm going to let Alex do this one because he's in the north.
We're in the north, so we start them inside. Generally, 6 to 8 weeks, and we get the seedlings going, and then we plant it out. And then here, it's 10 degrees Celsius overnight, which I think is 50 Fahrenheit overnight generally. So if you have that average, then you're putting your seedlings out, and then you get a quicker start on things. There's also varieties that are earlier maturing. The days of maturity are around 70, 75 days, which is just fine. You can plant them right outside. So, for cucurbits, you have a big option to be able to just plant it directly in the ground. Like we call it Victoria Day weekend here, and then Memorial Day weekend in the United States is a big weekend to plant things out. This year was a bit cold, but and then we had January up here, which was like freezing cold. It was like, 4 degrees Celsius, which wasn't very healthy for the plants to get going, but they weathered through it. You just got to wait a little bit till the soil gets, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Patty, 65 or 68 Fahrenheit. When the soil is that warm, then they'll germinate and grow, but they like it a little bit warmer.
Yep. I recommend all my growers to, get your soil thermometer out and don't plant any of you cucurbits, especially melons and watermelons, because they are desert, heat-loving plants, little water storage vessels. So, don't plant, if your soil temperature, any cucurbit in the ground below 65 degrees. People who tell you that cucurbits don't transplant well, it's a wives' tale. I believe, especially in a shorter growing season or a cooler growing season, getting a good start in your greenhouse or your cold frame or something like that, and then setting them out in an outdoor container or in a garden setting, I think works great for, creating more, extending your season and having those little guys get a better start. If your seedlings have a good start, then you're going to have a better performance throughout the course of the year.
Totally agree. Here's a really good question. I know it's true for tomatoes. So do cucurbit plants stop producing blossoms when air temperatures are more than 85, 90, 95? And will they start blooming again after temperatures return to maybe normal for a couple of weeks or a couple of days? So can you address that, where heat stops the blooming on cucurbits? I guess that's a question. Does heat stop the blooming on cucurbits like it does on tomatoes?
So I live in a very, very, very warm, long season growing area. And it is not abnormal for us to hit 100, to hit the century mark day after day after day after day for 2-3 months. The flowers don't stop as much as they don't pollinate. There's not that, they continue to flower. They just don't. It's incomplete pollination. There's pollen transfer, it germinates, and then, it just never, like you talked about, the fruit that just, they abort. So when the temperatures drop down to a more reasonable amount, yes, they start setting again. I don't necessarily see a decrease in flowering until it's above 105 in my production fields. But I can tell you above 103, the abortion level of the fruit is very, very high. It's like 85%. So I mean, if we have an extended period of over 102, 103, I know that we're only going to have like 15% of the seed set during that time, which isn't abnormal here to get, you know, a goofy hot spike like that. So now I have no idea, you know, outside of my area, you know, so, you know, I don't know. Is there like in the Northeast, maybe it stops when it's a combination of high humidity and high. I mean, Diane, have you seen that in your area? You're fairly high humidity compared to mine, which is relatively low at 30%.
Right. Right. I haven't seen that humidity impacts the flowering, but I'm, you know, I'm not a seed breeder and I'm not out there every day checking things either. But yeah, I mean, it's been very, very humid here over the last couple of weeks, and I still have tons of flowers.
Yeah, I don't know. The heat level is about 105, where then the plants just kind of, they kind of get in like a suspension. You know, they kind of just, you know, hang out, and then the temperature drops, and it takes a good 2, 3, 4 days for them to start flowering again after we hit those crazy 105, 107 degree temperatures. So.
Anything to add on that, Alex?
We don't really experience high temperatures.
Except today.
Except for this week.
Yeah. Except for this week.
Yeah. We have more of the other issues where it's just too cold and then they'll rot. But
so that's what would happen then if you have a big long cold streak, is more rotting than just not blooming for a while.
Yeah, like January, like we had such cold, wet weather. It was like May was the driest we've had on record, and then June brought the weather like crazy, and it was just very wet. So, like, you know, as Patty was mentioning, if it's too wet, they're not doing well. Is, you know, they're just gonna flop over and pretty well die because it's just so wet all the time. And if your soil is like in where West Coast Seeds is heavy clay, it holds that moisture. And they just don't do well. They'll just kind of suffer and hope for the best. And then out here, we have like sandy loam, so like, you know, carrots do really well, and the squash do fantastic because it just drains well if it gets too much rain. Yeah.
Good. So let's talk about growing vertically. We mentioned it a little bit earlier. I mean, I always grow my vining cucumbers on a trellis, and they're great, but they don't get that big. So do you have any tips, or would you say, oh, just don't bother on certain things because of how big they get? And can you talk about like the strength of the trellis that you would need? Any tips on growing vertically for any cucurbits?
Oh yeah, I use we use a lot of like if you're a home gardener, there's like a wire mesh that they use for building garages. It's not very big, but it's a 7 by 3 or 4 feet wide trellis. I use it for peas as well, like that super sugar snap. And they'll last like 20 years. So, you know, you let the plants grow up it, and then a lot of our customers, they actually use old nylons to hold the squash. And some of the squash and some of these things that we've trialed with them, one was called actually cut melon. It's not really a melon. It's more of a crossed pumpkin. But this thing grew 1.5 inches a day. They were measuring it. And you could actually cut it and it would heal itself and keep on growing. But this puppy was, I think, 4 feet and probably 20 pounds. So you have to really, like, you know, have something underneath it to hold it up. And then if you trellis it, they'd grow nice and straight, and they're nicer to see, because when you walk underneath the trellis, you can see how big the fruit are. If you do that, then it just, a lot of times the fruit's not on the ground. You don't get that yellowing. As you know, as the squash will sit on the ground, or the melons, or the cucumbers, and then they just look much nicer. So for weight, I would suggest that, you know, you can't use like, you know, a 1x2. You have to use some strong, like I use T-posts. They're like a strong metal post that you can use for farming. And they have like little ridges on them, and Home Depot and all the hardware stores would have those. You just pound those in, and then they can hold the twine really nicely, as well as that metal. That's what we do out here. Yeah.
I say I love to grow cucurbits vertically. One year in my trial gardens, I grew my pumpkins and winter squash on the chain link fence. They climbed up there great. They, they supported. I had fruit hanging all of it. And then we had our first frost and it was just nothing but winter squash all down the fencing. Yeah, put it on a fence line. We that we there's a lot of kids here that participate with the county fairs, and hog fencing works great. Get a 4x4 and put it in the ground, and then support the hog fencing in between. Put your watermelons, put your cucumbers, put your pumpkins up there. I I've put, arbors up and then grown pumpkins over one side and then over the other side, or gourds, and it's great fun. Kids love it. I always grew my cucumbers when the girls were kind of like on a short A-frame that wasn't even 2 feet off the ground, and the cucumbers fell down, and they were much easier to get down there and pick. You didn't have to look on, and they hung down, you just pinch them off. So there's all kinds of innovative ways. I mean, I would have to say one of the coolest, it was up at we were in Canada, where at
It was at
Connie's place.
Stokes. I think it was at Stokesy. They had the little hammocks. Is that what you're remembering? Is how they?
No, I
tied
remember.
those?
I remember Connie's brother built her that crazy TPA frame that they grew all their cucurbits on, and it was very cool.
Yeah, I
And
remember that too. Right.
that
Yeah.
was like the coolest, and it was huge. And then they also used it for a tent, even for the kid, because the kids and the grandkids slept out in the tent too. And I'm sure you've seen at, arboretums and this and that, where they just cover it with, metal mesh, and then they have all the gourds and the pumpkins. It is so cool. And then it doesn't take up any, I call it real estate, in your backyard. And a lot of people just trellis them on a fence line. I mean, if you have a fence line in your garden in a nice sunny spot, just, trellis it up your fence. Just make sure that you have enough, support that, they can climb on, because they're super heavy. But at the same time, the rewards are going to be incredible. And then you're not going to have as much problems with pests either. It's easier to spray. I mean, if you're spraying with neem oil or something like that once a week, it's easier to get the coverage. The critters don't come out of the ground to come attack your bounty. So, when you think about it, it just makes a whole lot more sense, to put a little bit of extra thought or a little extra preparation into it. And then, your rewards are going to be incredible.
So is there a magic number, a magic weight? Like, like I said, I grew my cucumbers. I didn't have to support them. They're plenty strong enough to hang down from their vines when they're trailing up a trellis or something. So is it, if something's going to be 5 pounds, 10 pounds, what's that magic number where you really should put that hammock or nylons or something to support them?
So
the fruit.
I'd say, a 1 to 2 pound fruit, something larger than that, you should try to support it a little bit more. And it takes nothing. You can use anything. Cheesecloth, super duper inexpensive cheesecloth that you can just pick up, at, hardware store or at Walmart or anywhere. And then you can just tie it to whatever. Most cantaloupes and watermelons are typically over that size, unless they're mini fruits. The average jack-o'-lantern pumpkin weighs 12 to 15 pounds. So, but those, and then some of them, the stems are much sturdier. So you're gonna discover, some melons slip, some melons don't. Of course, the ones that slip, your melons are going to fall off if you don't support them. Then the ones like cantaloupe or honeydews typically don't slip. Oh, are you kidding? They'll hang there forever until you come in with a pair of nippers and come. And most tomatoes pumpkins and watermelons have a pretty good attachment, so they'll hang pretty good.
Yeah.
So yeah, great fun.
Yeah. Yeah. You said something that was one of my questions also about tips for harvesting. Clip them, pull them, twist them. What's the best way to harvest your cucurbit fruits?
I just clip them. That's what I do for my pumpkins and, everything. And watermelons too. But I always have a knife with me. I mean, I have a knife in my pickup, so I always have a knife with me. And every time I go out to the garden, I have a knife with me. So, I mean, I just, serrated knife is what I harvest them all with.
So in other words, don't show up unannounced at Patty's place.
Beware of her knives.
Yeah, I always have a knife in the pickup with me.
Yeah. But for us, yeah, we just pinch the cucumbers though. That's the only difference. But all the other squash pretty well. Yeah, you're cutting it.
Okay.
Especially with some of the beautiful pumpkins now, they have a really nice handle. And a lot of people, like if it's going to be a jack-o'-lantern type, it's going to have a really nice sturdy handle on it. So you're going to have to cut it off just above that little part where it turns. Yeah.
For decorative purposes and for health, so that you don't leave it without the stem and something will get in there and
plus they're kind of pokey. Pumpkins and winter squash can be pretty pokey. Their stems can be corky and pokey. Some cantaloupe, some melon species, you don't need to, because that's how you tell if they're mature, is they'll just come off the vine and then that they're ripe.
Excellent. A question here about curing winter squash for storage.
I can tell you what we do. We leave it in the garden. We don't really it depends on how ripe it is, but we have cool, wet falls here. Like sometimes punishing rain comes September 2nd and lasts for a whole week. The fruit will stay out there, and what happens is for winter squash, what we found is you leave it out there a little longer. It's with that cooler weather, not necessarily a hard frost, but a little bit of a frost, it just builds that skin up and then it lasts longer. What we also do is just wipe the fruit off. So we don't use a bleach solution, more of like just soapy water and rinse it off. We still have squash from last year in our garage. So
when did you bring it into the garage then?
Oh, probably end of October.
Okay. So before the first hard frost?
Yeah. We get it out of the field. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we do a similar thing. I just let them sit in the field until after the first frost, and then all the vines that's actually when I do my winter squash evaluations, because I want to climb through all the vines and pokies on my legs anyway. So I wait till, after the first frost and all the vines and the powdery mildew kills everything. And then we go and pick them. And then I will store them in like boxes or crates after, and then pick them so there's air movement, or, and then I can leave them in a dark, cool place until I've even left them on my front porch and then, eaten them put a fall display up and eaten them through, Valentine's Day out there. But we have very cool weather here in the winter time, so it's almost like it's refrigerated outside. I mean, similar to what Alex is talking about. But I think the secret to curing your winter squash is to have them plant them so they mature enough, because they're a hard squash, and you can tell when the skin starts to get very, very, very hard, and you can't put your nail into it, there's no depression, then they're almost going to cure themselves after the vines start to senesce. They're in the process of curing and being done. But I've never grown in an area where they're super warm and you have to pick them, and they almost act like a perennial. I'm sure if you're somewhere in the South, you've got to go pick them, and what do they say in Houston, Texas? They might get their first frost by December. So when did the trees turn in Southeast Texas? So
really it's they will pretty much cure themselves by the time of the first frost or so. Like I'm up here in Chicago, so I could bring them in, probably store them in my cool but not cold garage, as long as there's good air circulation.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
put them on a shelf. I mean, you could put them stack them up on a shelf, put them in a box. I mean, I could imagine somebody having, a corner of their cool garage they would store all winter, and you could just put them on, wire rack shelf.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. If anybody else has any questions, put them in the chat. But Alex and Patty, do you want to do any other last tips or summaries? Is there something we didn't ask in all those questions?
One thing we didn't talk about was, and we talk about it here, where if you want to grow cucumbers or tomatoes, and you live on, I don't know, 18th floor of a west-facing condo with a balcony, you can actually grow tomatoes and cucumbers by choosing the Parthenon carpet types. So you don't need pollinators for those types, and generally they're going to be like the seedless cucumbers. Example, what have an example? Well, Piccolino, I guess, would be a one. Correct me if I'm wrong, Patty, but I know we do have some varieties that are like that, where the fruit will grow. It doesn't need a pollinator, and if it does get a pollinator, then you'll have seeds. So it's one way to actually.
So it was parthenocarpic.
Yeah.
Okay, and
Basically seedless.
and they will say that, like, if they're going onto your website or another seed retailer's website, it will define them as such, so that anybody who's living, like you say, on an 18th floor, that's what they would need to look for.
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Any other final comments from you, Patty?
Nope. They're actually, cucurbits are some of the easiest garden species to grow.
And there's so many different types. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think when we were talking about some trellising, I was reminded of the fact that we just wrote a blog post about like children's gardening and structures that you can garden in. It's the year of the sunflower. So we said how to make a sunflower teepee, but we also had some suggestions on growing pole beans, for like a little garden escape for kids. I always send a follow-up to everybody who registered for the webinar. So we'll send a recording, and I'll also send a link to that blog post that we had, because that's kind of fun if anybody wants to do that. So I kind of think we're wrapping up right on time. Aren't we good?
We covered lots of topics too. Yeah.
I know we did cover a lot of topics. So yeah, I thank you, Patty and Alex. It's good to see you. Good to hear your tips. I thank everybody here for attending. We'll do a quick follow-up email later this afternoon. And we've got more webinars coming up later this summer. So it's always good timely topics for maybe when some pests are hitting, or good harvest topics. That's always good to know also. So yeah, thank you very, very much. Good to see you guys, and stay cool out there in your hot Western temperatures.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.